Ondrelle had not expected to be ranked last. She had expected, perhaps, to be ranked poorly. She had no dowry, no house standing behind her name, and a stammer that surfaced only under the particular pressure of being looked at by men who had already decided what they thought of her. But last, out of 11 candidates, with the council scribe reading her name aloud in a voice that did not bother to lower itself, was a specific kind of humiliation she had not prepared for. She had stood at the end of the long hall for the better part of an afternoon, watching the 10 women ahead of her be assessed the way livestock were assessed at a border market, turned slightly, asked to speak a sentence or two, thanked, dismissed to a bench to await the result. Her own turn had lasted less than a minute. A councilman she did not recognize had glanced at the paper bearing her family's name, noted aloud that the house had been dissolved for 3 years and carried no debts worth collecting, and moved on before she had finished the sentence she had been asked to say. She understood, standing there, that she had not been evaluated at all. She had been a formality the process required to complete before the real decision, made somewhere else entirely, could be announced. Her mother would have told her not to expect otherwise. Her mother had spent the last years of her life teaching Ondrelle exactly how little the world rewarded a woman for being noticed, and exactly how much it could cost her. It was her mother's voice, more than her own resolve, that kept Ondrelle's spine straight walking out of that hall. She had walked out of the capital's long hall with her spine straight, because that was the only thing left that was hers to control, and had not cried until she reached the coach that would take her north, away from the court entirely, to the king's winter estate, where, she was told, almost as an afterthought, by a steward who did not meet her eyes, there was a vacancy for a keeper of ledgers. It was not a consolation. It was a place to put her where she would stop being anyone's problem. The estate was 3 days north, by a road that grew colder with every mile, until the trees gave way to a white flatness broken only by the black shape of the king's hall on its hill, smoke rising from 4 chimneys into a sky the color of a bruise. Ondrelle spent the ride sharing a coach with 2 guards who spoke to each other and not to her, and a merchant's clerk who fell asleep before the 2nd hour and did not wake until the gate. She did not mind the silence. Silence, unlike conversation, had never once betrayed her. Ondrelle had heard the stories, the way everyone had. The Alpha King Vardrek Ashmore, who had gone to the winter estate after his wolf stopped answering to anyone at court, who conducted his rule now through letters carried south by riders who did not linger, who had not taken a mate in 11 years, despite 3 kingdoms' worth of daughters paraded in front of him. There were less flattering versions of the story, too, murmured in the capital's kitchens rather than its halls. That the wolf's silence was a kind of grief no one could name, that the king himself had begun to seem, to those who served him closely, like a man waiting for something he could not describe and did not expect to arrive. She had not expected to meet him. Ledger keepers did not meet kings. She had expected corridors and cold ink and a small room with a narrow bed, and had been correct about all 3. What she had not expected was the seeing. It had come to her at 9 years old, the year her mother died, and her mother had spent the last of her strength making Ondrelle promise never to speak of it. Ondrelle had kept that promise for 15 years. It was not sight in the ordinary sense. She did not see visions, or futures, or ghosts. She saw the shape underneath things, the true weight of a promise versus its performed sincerity, the hairline fracture in a smile that meant a lie was standing just behind it, the particular stillness a person's hands took on when what they said and what they meant had come apart from each other. She had learned, over 15 years, to keep her face empty when she saw it. She had learned that people who noticed you noticing them did not forgive you for it. Her room, when she was shown to it, was smaller than the pantry she had slept beside as a child, but it had its own door, which was more privacy than she had owned in 3 years, and she found she could not resent it. The estate's steward, a tired man named Corbin, who clearly viewed her arrival as one more small inconvenience in a long list of them, showed her the archive room without ceremony, and told her the previous keeper had died of a winter fever, and no one had touched the ledgers since. She understood, looking at the dust, that she had not been sent here to fill a need. She had been sent here to be somewhere else. The estate's ledgers were 3 decades deep and badly kept, and within her first week, Ondrelle had found 4 discrepancies that the previous keeper had either missed or been paid to miss. She corrected them without comment, in the margins, in a hand small enough not to draw attention, and did not sign her corrections, because signing things had never gone well for her. She had learned young that being useful was the safest form of being present. A servant who corrected an error quietly and took no credit for it was rarely resented, while a servant who was merely liked could be discarded the moment liking became inconvenient. She had built an entire adulthood on that principle, and it had served her well enough until the wolf sat down in the snow and made usefulness impossible to hide behind any longer. She did not know that the king read those ledgers himself, some nights, when sleep would not come. She did not know that he had noticed, 3 days running, a set of corrections in a hand he did not recognize, precise and unclaimed, fixing errors that had sat wrong in his chest for months, without his being able to say why. She did not know that he had asked the steward who kept the northern accounts now and been told, dismissively, a girl, sent up from the capital selections, and had felt something in him go very quiet and very interested, in a way he had not felt in 11 years. She found out he had noticed on the 9th day, when she was crossing the lower courtyard at dusk, and his wolf, enormous, black-grey, a thing she had only heard described and never seen, came around the corner of the stables at a dead stop, exactly as if it had walked into a wall. It did not growl. It did not approach the way the stories said alpha wolves approach things they wanted to frighten. It simply sat down in the snow, 6 feet from her, and looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has walked past every day of his life and never noticed opened onto a room. Ondrelle did not move. Moving, in her experience, drew attention, and attention was the thing she had spent 15 years learning to avoid. She stood with her arms full of ledgers and watched the wolf watch her, and felt, underneath the fear, which was real, and underneath the cold, which was also real, the particular vertigo of seeing something true and not being able to name what it meant. Behind the wolf, at the far end of the courtyard, a man stopped walking. Vardrek Ashmore had felt his wolf go somewhere without him 3 times in his life. Once at his father's death, once at his coronation, when the weight of it had briefly been too much for either of them to carry alone. And now, in his own courtyard, watching his wolf sit in the snow in front of a woman he had exchanged perhaps 4 words with, doing something he had not decided to do and could not, from where he stood, understand or stop. He watched it happen and felt, with a disorientation that unsettled him more than anger would have, that he was watching himself find something. Nothing was said about it. That was the strange part in the days after. No one raised it, not the steward, not the 2 guards who had seen it from the gate and gone very still. It was as if the estate had decided, collectively, and without discussion, that the thing that had happened in the courtyard had not happened, because there was no category prepared to hold it in. Ondrelle understood that silence better than anyone. She had lived inside a version of it her whole life. The only person who did mention it, obliquely, was Tildren, a kitchen servant, a few years older than Ondrelle, who brought bread to the archive room some evenings without being asked, and had a talent for saying important things while appearing to discuss something else entirely. "The wolf doesn't sit," she said, setting the bread down without looking at Ondrelle directly. "Not for anyone. Not in 11 years, that I've heard of." She left before Ondrelle could answer, which Ondrelle understood correctly as its own kind of kindness, an offering of information without the burden of a reply. but the king began finding reasons to walk past the ledger room. She noticed everything. That was the curse of it. That he never came in, never asked her anything directly, simply passed the doorway at times of day that had no natural reason to bring him there, and once stood in the corridor outside for the length of 11 breaths before continuing on, as though he had come specifically to not enter and had needed to stand somewhere to accomplish it. Brigard Sten, the king's loyal beta, was the first person of any real standing to say anything to her that was not strictly procedural. He found her crossing the lower hall on the 11th day and fell into step beside her without asking permission, a broad, weathered man who smelled of horse and leather and spoke the way soldiers spoke, directly and without decoration. "Whatever you did in that courtyard," he said, "you should know his wolf hasn't slept right in 11 years. If it's settled near you, that's not nothing. Most people around here would kill to matter that much to something that large." He did not wait for a response, only nodded once and continued on, and Ondrelle stood in the corridor a long moment, turning the sentence over, uncertain whether it had been a warning or a welcome, and suspecting, from the particular directness in his eyes, that it had been both. She found the ledger correction he had left for her on the 14th day. Not a correction of her work, which had none, but a note in the margin of a page she had flagged 3 weeks earlier as unresolved. "You were right about this. It took me 3 weeks to prove it. I don't know how you knew in one evening. No name, no signature." She knew his hand from the estate seals well enough to recognize it anyway, and sat holding the page for longer than the moment warranted, feeling something in her chest do a slow and unfamiliar thing. There was, too, an evening in the second week that neither of them ever spoke of afterward as anything other than accidental, when she had fallen asleep at the archive table over an account book, and woken to find a second bowl of stew set beside her own, still warm, and the king himself seated across the table, with a ledger of his own open in front of him, reading in companionable silence, as though he had been there an hour and intended to stay another. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them needed to. She ate the stew, and he turned his pages, and the candle between them burned down by a full inch before he rose, murmured a good night that contained more warmth than the word strictly required, and left her to finish her work with her pulse doing something unfamiliar and stubborn in her throat. She began, without deciding to, watching him the way she watched everyone, for the fracture behind the performance, the gap between what a person said and what sat underneath it. She found, to her considerable surprise, that there was almost no gap in him at all. He was tired in a way that showed, and careful in a way that had clearly been beaten into him by court rather than chosen. And when he spoke to the stable hands or the kitchen staff, there was no seam between his public voice and whatever voice he might have kept for himself. She had never, in 24 years, met anyone who did not perform some version of themselves for an audience. It unsettled her more than the wolf had. The recognition, when it came sideways, the way true things always did with her. She was in the archive room past midnight, working through a section of accounts that dated back 30 years, the era, she realized slowly, of the king's own parents' marriage, and found a ledger entry that made no sense. A payment, disguised as a tithe to the Northern Chapel, made monthly for 11 years, to an apothecary 2 provinces away, who dealt, according to a second cross-referenced page, in bonding suppressants. The payments stopped the year the old king died. They had been authorized both times by the same signature, a dusk-hollow seal, the family that had produced 3 generations running, the Alpha King's closest advisers, and currently the woman who ran his council in his absence, Lady Kerwin Duskhollow, whose smile Ondrelle had clocked as false within 4 seconds of meeting her, and filed away, as she filed away most dangerous things without acting on it. She sat with the ledger a long time before she understood what she was looking at. Someone, 30 years ago, had been suppressing a bond. Not the king's, his mother's, or his father's, or both, the mate bond of the previous king, chemically silenced for 11 years by a member of the family that had spent 3 generations making itself indispensable to the throne, for reasons Ondrelle could not yet prove but could already, with the particular dread of someone who saw too clearly guess at. She thought, more than once in the hours after, of asking Ferrant Vole, the estate's ancient archivist, who had held the position since before the old king's death, and who was, by every account, too far past caring about hierarchy to maintain it. She found him the following afternoon among the deepest shelves, a stooped man with ink-stained hands, who looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that suggested he had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask him the right question. "There was a woman," he said, before she had said anything at all, "before the old queen. No one speaks of her now. I was young enough then that I remember her laugh better than I remember her face, which tells you something about how thoroughly a thing can be erased if the right family wants it erased." He would not say more than that. His hands shook faintly when he spoke of it, in a way that told her it was fear rather than age. But he pressed a small, brittle scrap of a chapel receipt into her hand, one he had kept folded inside a psalter for 30 years, for reasons he said he had never fully understood himself, and told her to look at the seal. She did not go to the king immediately. She had learned, at great cost, that being right about something dangerous did not protect you from the danger. It usually just told you exactly where the danger would come from next. She copied the relevant pages in her own hand, in case the originals disappeared, and hid the copies inside the binding of a ledger no one else had reason to open. Then she went back to her narrow room and did not sleep. Ondrelle spent the 2 days after the confrontation with Curwen learning to sleep less and watch corridors more, a habit she recognized in herself with some bitterness. She had spent 15 years training her body out of vigilance, only to find it returning within an afternoon of remembering that she mattered enough to someone dangerous to be worth removing. She told no one but the king, and even then only after he pressed her twice, that she had begun checking the latch on her door before sleeping. He said nothing to that beyond a single nod, but the following evening a second lock appeared on her door, fitted without comment by one of the estate's carpenters, and she understood it for what it was, not a cage, the opposite of one, the first door in her adult life that had been made more secure specifically for her benefit rather than someone else's convenience. Lady Curwen Duskhollow was, by every visible measure, a woman above reproach, composed, gracious, tirelessly competent, beloved by a court that had watched her hold the kingdom's daily business together, through 11 years of a king who would rather live in the snow than in his own capital. She had never once, in Ondrelle's 3 weeks of observation, raised her voice or her hand. She used petitions instead. She used procedure the way other people used knives, precisely, and from a distance, and in a way that left her hands clean enough to accept condolences afterward. She found Ondrelle in the archive room on the 19th day, 3 days after the ledger discovery, and Ondrelle understood, from the particular gentleness of her tone, that she already knew. "You've been thorough," Sherwin said, looking not at Ondrelle, but at the shelf behind her, at the specific ledger Ondrelle had not yet managed to reshelve. "More thorough than the position requires. I wonder sometimes if we've wasted you here." "I do the work I'm given," Ondrelle said, which was true, and said nothing else, which was also, by now, a kind of instinct. "Of course." Sherwin smiled, and Ondrelle watched the fracture sit behind it, plain as a crack in ice. "There's a position opening in the Southern Archive. Better rooms, better pay, considerably further from the cold. I could have the transfer arranged within the week. You've earned better than this posting." It was, Ondrelle understood immediately, not an offer. It was a removal, dressed as a kindness, exactly the way the ledger's tithe payments had been dressed as chapel charity. She said she would consider it, because saying no outright to Curwen Duskhollow was not a thing anyone at the estate did twice, and spent the walk back to her room with her heart going too fast, understanding for the first time in 19 days that she had stopped being invisible, and that the king's wolf, sitting down in the snow, had cost her the only safety she had ever reliably had. She told the king that night. She had not planned to. She had planned, if anything, to disappear quietly into the southern transfer and let the ledger copies rot in their hiding place, because that was what 19 years of learning to survive attention had trained her to do. But she found him in the courtyard, standing where his wolf had sat 3 weeks earlier, looking at the same patch of snow as though it still held something, and the words came out of her before her instinct for silence could stop them. She had rehearsed the telling on the walk over, in the flat, procedural voice she used for reporting ledger discrepancies, because that voice was safe, and this was not. It abandoned her within the first 2 sentences anyway. She heard her own words come out unsteady, watched his jaw tighten at the mention of the tithe payments, watched something colder settle behind his eyes when she reached the apothecary's contract and the dates, and had to stop once, briefly, to master her own breathing before she could finish. He listened without interrupting, which she had not expected, and when she finished, he was very still in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of his wolf. "My mother," he said finally, "died when I was 6. My father remarried within the year. I always thought—" He stopped, started again. "I always thought there was something wrong with how quickly he stopped grieving her. I thought it meant he hadn't loved her at all." "I think," Ondrelle said carefully, "it might have meant something was done to make sure he couldn't." He looked at her then the way his wolf had looked at her in the courtyard, the door he had walked past every day, suddenly, finally, open. "Show me the ledger." He asked, that first night, why she had never told anyone what she could see, and she found herself answering more honestly than she had planned to. "My mother watched her sister accused of witchcraft for saying out loud that a magistrate's grief for his wife was performed rather than real. It was true. It cost her sister an ear and a year in a cage regardless. She had expected him to look at her differently after that, with caution, or with the particular fascination people reserve for things they found useful rather than human, and found instead that he simply looked sad on her behalf, and asked no more questions that night, and let the silence between them be the kind that didn't require filling. They confirmed it together over the following week, in stolen hours after the household slept, cross-referencing shipping manifests and chapel records and the testimony, eventually, of an old apothecary's apprentice who had spent 30 years terrified to speak and wept with something like relief when someone finally asked. Serwyn Duskhollow's grandmother had authorized the suppression the year the old king fell in love with a woman the Duskhollow family considered beneath the throne, not Vardrek's mother, but a woman before her, whose bond the old king had never been permitted to complete, whose existence had been erased so thoroughly from the record that even the king himself had never heard her name until Ondrelle found it, water-stained, in a chapel donation ledger 31 years buried. The nights they spent bent over that evidence were, Ondrelle would later understand, when the rest of it happened. Not the anomaly, not the wolf, but the actual thing, the thing the wolf had only been pointing toward. He asked her opinion and waited for the answer instead of moving past the silence. He noticed when her hands went cold at 2 a.m., and without comment, without making it a moment, simply moved the single working brazier closer to her side of the table. Once, reading a particularly damning entry aloud, his voice caught on the old king's name, and he stopped and pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes, and she said nothing and did not look away. And something about being allowed to witness that, without needing to perform comfort. At him settled a thing in her chest she had not known was unsettled. He walked her back to her room on the 4th night of that week, down a corridor lit by a single wall torch, and stopped a half-step before her door, close enough that she could see the exact color his eyes went in low light, warm gold catching the torch's flame, while the corridor's stone reflected a cold blue-grey along the line of his jaw. "I keep finding reasons to be near you that have nothing to do with any of this," he said, low, like a confession he had not planned to make. "I want you to know I've noticed that. I don't know what to do with it yet, but I've noticed." Her breath went short. She did not step back. "I noticed you noticing," she said, "several weeks before the ledger." Something in him seemed to come loose at that. Relief, maybe, or permission. He lifted a hand, slow enough that she could have stopped it, and cupped the side of her face, his thumb resting just below her cheekbone, and she felt herself lean into the warmth of his palm before she had decided to. Neither of them moved further than that. His forehead came to rest against hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, both of them still for a long moment in the torchlight and the stone-cold air, the whole of it unbearably careful, as though either of them moving first might break something that had taken 30 years and one dead woman's silence to build. "Not yet," he said quietly, and she understood he did not mean not ever. He meant not until this is finished, not while she's still dangerous, not while I could still lose you to this. "Not yet," she agreed, and stepped back first, because someone had to, and went into her narrow room with her heart going faster than it had any right to over a man who had done nothing more than press his forehead to hers. In the days between the corridor and the coach, there was an afternoon Ondrelle would return to often in memory, quieter than the rest, the king finding her in the stable yard, teaching a stable boy's little sister her letters on a scrap of slate, patient in a way she rarely allowed herself to be with anyone but children, and Vardrek stopping in the doorway to watch far longer than the moment required, his expression unguarded in a way she only ever saw when he believed himself unobserved. He did not come in. He watched the girl sound out her own name under Ondrelle's steady correction, and when Ondrelle finally noticed him and looked up, he did not pretend he had just arrived. "She has your patience," he said, "of the child," though it was clear from his face that patience was not entirely what he meant. Selwyn moved against them 3 days later, when the southern transfer Ondrelle had never accepted was suddenly, officially processed, without her consent. A coach arranged for dawn, a writ bearing the king's own seal, forged, though it would take another 2 days to prove that, with a precision that told Ondrelle exactly how long Sherwin's family had been practicing this particular kind of erasure. Vardrek tore the writ in front of the assembled household himself, in the great hall, at first light, with a fury Ondrelle had not yet seen in him and would not see again. Not the wolf's fury, which was simple and physical, but the colder, older fury of a man who had just understood that the same hand that had stolen his father's grief had reached for the one thing he had found since. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said Selwyn Duskhollow's name once, in front of the full household, and asked her to explain the seal. She did not break in front of the room, not entirely. 30 years of composure did not dissolve in a single morning, but Ondrelle watched the fracture she had clocked on the first day finally show all the way through, watched fear replace the practiced grace in Selwyn's eyes the moment she understood the ledger, the apprentice's testimony, and the king's fury had all arrived in the same room at the same time. There was no dramatic confession. There was, instead, exactly what the institution required: a formal accusation laid before the full council within the week, the water-stained chapel ledger and the apprentice's sworn testimony entered as evidence, the forged writ produced last, when the room had already turned. Selwyn Duskhollow was stripped of her council seat and confined to house arrest pending trial, her family's 3 generations of indispensability undone in an afternoon by a woman whose name the council scribe had once read last, in a voice that hadn't bothered to lower itself. There was one final danger before it was truly finished: a cousin of the Duskhollow line, a minor lord with more pride than sense, who arrived at the estate gates 2 nights before the trial's verdict with an armed party, and a claim that the ledger evidence had been fabricated by a woman of no house attempting to seize influence above her station. Brigade Sten met him at the gate before the man's horse had fully stopped, flanked by 6 of the king's own guard, and informed him, without raising his voice, that he was welcome to make that argument to the council directly, provided he made it unarmed. The lord did not stay to argue further. Vardrek, when he heard of it afterward, said nothing about the incident, except to ask, quietly, whether Ondrelle had been frightened, and seemed to relax only once she told him, honestly, that she had not had time to be. Ondrelle stood at the back of the council chamber through all of it, and felt, for the first time in 15 years, entirely unafraid of being seen. Word of the verdict reached the Winter estate 3 days ahead of the official writ, carried by a rider who had ridden through the night rather than wait for morning, and Ondrelle heard it first from Brigade Sten, who found her in the archive and simply said, "It's done," with the particular relief of a man who had spent 2 months half expecting the institution to fail them, the way institutions so often failed people without name or house behind them. She did not celebrate exactly. She sat with the news a long while, and found that what she felt most was not triumph, but a kind of loosening, as though a hand that had been pressing on her chest since she was 9 years old had finally, quietly, let go. The estate settled slowly, the way snow settles, in layers. It was 2 months before Cherwin's trial concluded. A cage sentence, proportional and unglamorous, exactly the kind of ending the institution allowed itself. And by then, the winter had turned toward something gentler, the Black Hall's chimneys still smoking, but the courtyard mud instead of ice. Ondrelle no longer worked the ledger room alone. She had been, by the king's own decree, and the council's grudging ratification, made keeper of the Northern Archive in truth, rather than in exile, her corrections signed now, her name on the door. Vardrek's wolf had taken, in the months since the courtyard, to lying across the threshold of her workroom on the coldest mornings, an enormous grey-black shape that the household had stopped pretending not to notice, and that no longer unsettled the ranked wolves who came through on estate business. They lowered their heads to her without being told to, the way water finds its own level. Ferronvol retired that spring, formally, with a pension the council approved without argument for the first time in anyone's memory, and spent his last afternoon in the archive, teaching Ondrelle the location of every ledger he had never dared show anyone else, including 3 that had nothing to do with the Dusk Hollow family at all, and everything to do with old debts the throne itself had never repaid to families with no one left to collect them. Ondrelle made a note to address each one. Tildren, when she heard, brought an extra loaf of bread to the archive that week, without explanation, and Ondrelle understood by now exactly what that meant, and did not ask her to explain it either. He found her in the archive on an ordinary evening in early spring, correcting a ledger that had nothing wrong with it, mostly so her hands would have something to do while she waited for him, though neither of them had ever said that part aloud. He came in without stopping in the doorway this time, crossed the room, and kissed the top of her head where she sat, his hand settling warm against the back of her neck, and she leaned back into him without looking up. The way she had learned finally that safety could look like something other than being unseen. "The Southern envoy asked today," he said into her hair, "when I intend to formalize things. I told him I'd ask you, since apparently that's a new practice I've adopted." "What did you tell him you thought I'd say?" "I told him I'd stopped guessing what you'd say months ago. That's rather the point of you." She turned in the chair to look up at him properly. Warm gold in his eyes from the last of the window's daylight, the cool stone-grey shadow of the archive shelves falling across the line of his shoulder, and found, for once, nothing underneath his face but exactly what he was showing her. No fracture, no gap. The same plain, honest thing she had first noticed the week her mother's promise had nearly cost her the chance to see it at all. "Ask me properly," she said, "and I expect I'll say yes." She said it lightly, the way she had learned to say important things, so that if the moment turned out to be smaller than it felt, she would have somewhere safe to retreat to. He did not let her retreat. He took her hand from the ledger, pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles, and told her, quietly and without any of his usual careful restraint, that he intended to ask her properly in front of the entire household, so that there would never again be a room in this kingdom where her name was read last, or read quietly, or not read at all. He did, later that week, in the courtyard, in the exact place his wolf had sat down 3 weeks after her arrival, and this time the whole household came out to watch, Bregard grinning openly for the first time since she had known him, Tildren crying without any attempt to hide it, Corban the steward, looking for once, entirely unbothered by the disruption to his schedule, and nobody pretended it hadn't happened. The wolf came too, unbidden, and sat in the exact spot it had chosen months before, and Ondrelle understood, watching it settle into the snow, that she had spent her whole life learning how to disappear, and had somehow, without ever intending to, ended up here instead, seen entirely by the one creature and the one man who had never once needed her to be anything smaller than what she was. She wrote, that night, in the front of a new ledger she had bound herself, the first entry that had ever borne her name from its very first line, and did not hesitate over the signature the way she once would have. If you'd been ranked last once, by people who never once looked closely enough to see what they were dismissing, tell me below. I want to know how many of us there are.